All right, so my point was though, if I graduated from college 2012, and I went to Kauai. My parents, or I graduated 2013. My parents forced me to go to Kauai, and my mom wouldn't talk to me. She didn't believe the quadrant model. My dad didn't believe the quadrant model. My grandpa didn't, and my grandpa tried to make me independent because he thought that if I became independent and got a job, then I would let go of the quadrant model. And because I built my competence and I let go of the quadrant model, he thought that I was just using it as a way to stay dependent on my mom and dad. The fact of the matter was, I really did discover theory of everything, and I needed more support. And it would have been helpful to just talk to my mom and dad, and it would have been helpful if they would have helped me get basketball videos. I could have done so much with the basketball videos. You don't know how much it helps me to be able to study what I did, and how much it elevates my game, improves my game like crazy. But there's nothing you can do about it, regardless. This is what happened. So, just back to the story though. So, as I said, my whole life I was a leftist. So I'll just give some more examples of that angle. So when I was on Kauai in 2013, when I was still a leftist, I remember I started dating some white girls, and remember my whole life I was a leftist and I didn't like white people. I was anti-white, and I really liked race mixing. Like I would look at black women and white, or black men and white women, and I'd really like that. And like I remember when I was in college, I would try to justify and rationalize that and be like, yeah, so races of social construction, and in our tribal societies, people had different temperaments, and because there was priests, and there was athletes who would be like artisans. So the priests would be like the idealists, and the athletes would be the artisans, and the workers would be the guardian SJs. And so there's different temperaments and different personality types. And so a black person from one tribe may have more in common with a white person from another tribe than two white people or two black people. And so it just makes sense that, black people and white people would mix this, because it's more based off temperament. And, but basically though, see, I was very like liberal and I thought that I was very conscious, but really I know I had an agenda. And I think it was because I saw myself as Jewish, and I didn't like white people. Like I saw Aryans as a threat, and I looked down upon white people, and I looked highly upon people of color, and I wanted people of color to defeat the white people. I saw myself as more of a person of color. And I know people look at me and say, that's crazy, you don't look, but that's the way that I saw it my whole life, because I think I saw myself as Jewish, right? So I didn't, so I was a leftist, and I was really, and I know it. And so when I start seeing, in, like David Duke and all these people saying like, yeah, Jews are for race mixing and they're against white people, I was like, there's some legitimacy to what they're saying, because I saw it my whole life. And then I thought about like and I like Jewish people a lot, because I remember a lot of my Jewish friends that like in college and throughout my life were very pro-black, and like some of the best basketball players I played with were Jewish. I was very good at basketball, and I think that was a part of the reason why I like basketball and rap so much, is because I saw it as more people of color and more anti-white. And but in 2014, it just became more apparent to me, like, yes, there is some legitimacy to what the white supremacists say. And just like some examples were, like, I would go online and I would see like a Jewish girl from my high school, and she dated black guys, and then she was in Africa and she was helping out black people. And I had this impression that she didn't like white people. She didn't like Aryans. She really liked people of color. And because she looked like more of a person of color. She was Jewish, but she looked more like a person of color, right? She had that kind of like Middle Eastern look, So, but I just started like, but I just analyzed my whole life, and I saw it. Like Jewish people I knew from when I was playing basketball, from my whole life, and I saw a favoritism toward people of color, and like especially liking black people, more of a leftist liberalism type of thing. Now I didn't associate too much with religious conservative Jews my whole life, and I know that I still do think that religion and conservatism is more quote unquote white supremacy, or pro-white, as opposed to anti-white. I was anti-white. I was against white people, and I was a big time leftist communist. And that was the way it was my whole life. So, but then in this time period in 2014, I started to adjust and started to change. And I'm starting thinking, maybe my whole anti-white thing my whole life is not beneficial. It's not healthy. and it's not like, and so I became more religious, and I became more, and I felt bad for white people, and I started thinking that, so I started changing my paradigm. I started changing my view, and basically everything that I thought before, like I just started thinking the exact opposite. This was like 2014. And like I said, really, I wanted to just talk to my mom and dad. And one of the reasons why I started becoming more conservative was I thought, well, maybe my dad will talk to me if I become more conservative. The other thing was, like, I wanted to get my basketball videos, and I screwed up by becoming a communist. And I thought that maybe a lot of people said, people said that they had basketball videos, but then when I became a communist and I was writing my stuff online, like I said, my mom deleted or hid all my stuff, but then I unhid it because she had my password. And, so I wrote a ton of crazy stuff, but I was writing it because my mom was hiding all of it. And I didn't know that people were not seeing it. And I was wondering why no one's reacting to my stuff. So all I'm saying is, if people would just communicate with me, all this crazy stuff would not have happened. Everything went out of control. But at this time period, everything went out of control. I wanted to get basketball videos, and I thought, okay, well, maybe if I become a right-winger and more religious, then people will give me basketball videos, because it didn't work out the communist way. I really just wanted basketball videos, study what I did, all that stuff, get back into basketball. And like I said, I can only rap when I was playing basketball. I can only rap when nervous, and people don't believe that. It's true. It's just the way it is. You can decide to not believe me and think I'm crazy or something, but that's just retarded, because there's no reason for me to lie about that stuff. I know that there's people who would lie about that stuff to try to make themselves, to make excuses. And for me, it's not the case. I'm an exception to the rule in all these aspects. I really did discover theory of everything. I'm not crazy. I'm an exception to the rule. Most people who say they discovered theory of everything are crazy. I'm an exception to the rule in a lot of ways. So, and I'm not trying to be arrogant. I'm not being arrogant. It's just like, I'm just being, just accurate and trying to say things the way that they are. I'm trying to accurately assess the situation. So, just back to the story, I became everything the opposite. So before, I would be like, I was against IQ. Now I'm like, okay, IQ, maybe IQ is related to wealth and success in life. And before, I think before, like, I looked at everything as like, black people and white people, it's just all based off environment. The reason why black people are good at sports is because they grew up in the ghetto, and if only white people grew up in the ghetto, they would be better at sports, and black people would be better in academics and all this stuff. And the reason why is because I wanted race mixing, and I wanted, basically dissolving of borders, and just like race is a social construction, all that. But then I started to look at it, I started to become more of like a race realist and be like, no, there is differences in races and stuff like that. And even if there isn't, like, still my agenda was to mix. And and now looking at it, what my grandpa would say, I had a predator-prey software orientation toward white people. And so I wanted to mix them. I wanted to defeat them. And I think it's because I saw myself as Jewish, so that's what I wanted. So then I started to become more of a race realist. I'm like, no, there is differences. And I started becoming more pro-nationalist. I was very anti-nationalist before, when I was a communist, and I was anti-white. Like, I was very pro-Palestinian. I was like, borders are just to maintain the status quo and white supremacy and maintain. I was a communist. So then I switched, and I became very pro-nationalist. And and the way that I saw it was, I wanted to be like, the way that I interpreted the Bible before was communist. I want to see it all communist. And I did a good job on INTP Central expounding that point of view. But then I switched, and I'm like, no. And then I started thinking, like, interracial sex and all that stuff is not good. So I started thinking, like, like in the Bible it says, stay within your own tribe and stuff. So then I started trying to teach that. And I'm like, well, maybe the, Germans should stay within the Germans, and the French within the French. And this idea that it's social constructions, it's not accurate. People say that, but it's not really true. There is genetic distinction between ethnic groups and stuff. And maybe it's best that people stay within their ethnic groups. And I wanted, and I was I became very pro-religious. So remember when I was a leftist, I was very much against, like, the anti-feminists and the people who are like, against Jezebel, right? And religious people, because I was like, those people, they just want to make women into baby makers, and it's just because they want to perpetuate their race. It's just white supremacy. It's just the desire to maintain racial division and make women into baby makers to stay within their own race, stop miscegenation, and marry and have a lot of kids to. It's for their racial survival, and I didn't want racial survival for any race. I wanted the races to mix, especially the white race, because I was anti-white. And so, but then I started becoming the opposite, and I'm listening to Molyneux, and I'm listening to all these alt-right guys, right, or like Peterson, the black guy who calls the women sluts and stuff, and he's the guy who said like the woman was like. Well, aren't you a slut because you have sexualized women? And he's like, I'm not a slut, I'm a slut maker. And now my grandpa, who's a medic psychiatrist, would say, no, either way, it's still self-confirmatory, and it's best to not engage in promiscuity and self-indulgence and all that. And it's more important to engage in inquiry and the flow and transcending the self and transcending the body, right? But at this time, I didn't really understand that because I didn't really understand my grandpa's teachings at this point. He didn't teach me very well at this point. So I went from being a leftist who was like very much like I was pro-pornography. I was pro-abortion because I was like, people who are against pornography, they're just the white supremacists. They're just the religious, conservative Fox News people who are just white supremacists, KKK members, Nazis, right? That's the way that I saw it. It's just, they just want to make women into baby makers, perpetuate their race and stuff like that. And they're just, they're primitive, right? That's the way that I wanted to see things. So I was always very much for homosexuality, for like abortion, for all that stuff. And then I switched in 2014. I switched and I was like, dude, and because I started becoming pro-white, and I started to becoming like, and I started being like, these white supremacists are right. The Jews do tend to be for pro-abortion and pro-pornography and stuff. And I was that way. And it's because they're predatory toward the white people. And that's the way I started seeing it. And I was like, dude, there's some accuracy to this. So then I became the opposite. And I was like, promiscuity isn't good. Like, I wanted to defend the white people. I wanted to defend the Aryans, right? And I wanted to, because before I wanted a mixture, and I wanted promiscuity, and I wanted like free sex, and I was like a Freudian, like, yeah, that's more healthy. And, if you're not free in sexuality, then that leads to repression, and that leads to psychosis and neurosis. And, I was on the leftist side of the spectrum. Now I know that actually evidence shows that the more sexually promiscuous a society, the more mentally ill the society, more people with mental illness, the more unhealthy people are mentally. But at that time, I wasn't aware of that. But, regardless, I was very much a leftist. But then I switched, and I became an extremist right wing. Like, dude, women should, and like I said, I went to Israel in 2013, and that's where the rabbis and stuff were teaching about, like, don't touch a woman before marriage. Don't even touch her physically. Don't, and I started like really espousing and expounding that, being a proponent of that way of seeing things. Like, and I know now that my grandpa would say, in a metapsychiatry perspective, it can be beneficial to be like that, because you want to focus first on the kingdom of heaven, focus first on inquiry, expanding awareness, all that stuff. And, and not necessarily on self-confirmatory relationships and, sexuality, which is more pleasure oriented and self-indulgence and stuff. And because you want to transcend the body to the flow, you want to transcend the mind to the flow and transcend the self. But at this time, I wasn't aware of that. But I did still kind of see, like, what I did was I was like, dude, before I was anti-white, and I was very much for promiscuity and porn and stuff. And now I'm realizing, I was listening to the white supremacists, and they're saying how porn is like destroying the white people, and in like abortion and all this stuff. It's destroying the white people. It's destroying the white race. And I was like, dude, before I was cool with that. I liked that because I was anti-white. But then I started to be like, dude, this is wrong. And I started seeing myself as more white. And again, like I said, one of the other things that caused that switch was when I was on Kauai, I had the white girlfriends. And remember, I was anti-white. I didn't like white people, but I had the white girlfriends, and I was having intercourse with them. And I thought to myself, if I have a baby with one of these girls, the baby's going to be white. And I remember that was like a big, I guess you could call it like an identity, they call it like identity crisis, but like that was a big shift that I was undergoing, because I was like, wait, if I have kids that with these girls are going to be white. I always imagined myself either having a kid with a Jewish girl or even a girl of color, because I was most attracted to them. Even when I was with the white girls, I liked the white girls better that had more like quote unquote exotic, like ethnic features, because I was anti-white my whole life. So like even when I would have intercourse with them, I would like focus on the features I thought that were the most ethnic, right? Or the most exotic. I was like a quote unquote black supremacist. I was like a person of color supremacist. And but like I said, I started to shift. But I started thinking like, well, what if I have kids that's white? And I was like, am I going to hate the kid? Am I going to want that kid to be destroyed? Like I want white people being destroyed. So I started to have like my mentality started to alter. And I started to realize like, whoa, my mentality is not beneficial. It's not. And so I shifted though, and I became very pro-white. And then, and like I said, I became sort of pretty much a white supremacist kind of, I was taking all the opposite viewpoints I did before. Before I wanted to look at like, my grandpa was a fan of Warren Buffett. I was like, well, my grandpa's just a white supremacist. He's just into like rich people, because rich people that, in economics, that just maintains a status quo. And, it's just through luck, and it's just through privilege. They just get rich through luck and privilege and stuff like that. And, white privilege and all that stuff. But then I started thinking in terms of like, no, people work, my grandpa's very into working hard. And I was like, no, yeah, again, white supremacist viewpoint, working hard, so important. No, it's not. It's mainly luck. It's mainly privilege and stuff like that, right? It's mainly nepotism and all that. But then I started to switch, and I became the opposite. And I'm like, yeah, people should be rewarded for working hard. And, and high IQ and high intelligence gets you better rewards and gets you, success in life. And why do we punish? So I went from being a communist, like, yeah, we should share the wealth and take it from the white people and the people who are successful. And then I went to the opposite extreme. I'm like, no, and again, the truth of the matter is probably like in between. It's not. But regardless, before, when I was a communist, I was anti-white. I was predatory toward white people. And then I started shifting. I'm like, no. And I became very pro-white, and I became extremist the other way. So I was very much extremist. I was like an Orthodox Jew, and I did kind of become an Orthodox Jew at that time. I was wearing the tzitzit, I was wearing the kippah, because, and like I said, I didn't like Orthodox Judaism before because I thought it was white supremacist. I thought that religion was white supremacist. And I thought that they were against people of color because, people of color tend to be more sinful. But in my mind, when I was a communist, I'm like, yeah, they're more sinful because they're, they're treated bad, and because of the Pygmalion effect, stereotype effect, and they act out their stereotypes, and because, of their economic hardships that are forced upon them by the white man. That's why I was when I was a communist and anti-white. But then I start looking at the other way, and I'm like, no, maybe maybe they are, people of color are naturally, more, impulsive and more criminal. And I started seeing that when I was on Kauai, and I'm starting questioning this stuff. So I became the opposite. I became like more of a white supremacist and more of a nationalist. So I went from being a communist to a nationalist. I went from being anti-religious to very religious. And, but my grandpa would say that I still was in the ego. Maybe I wasn't completely in the flow yet, but at the time I didn't understand that. And I'll get to that more later. And he ended up confusing me and making me into a leftist again later, and I'll get to that. But regardless, this is what the shift that I went through in 2014. So then I'm posting all this stuff online. And so before, I was very much for homosexuality. I was like, the only Nazis, KKK members are against homosexuality. The only reason why people are against homosexuality is because because they want to have children that have their genes pass on to future generations. And if they have a homosexual child, he can't have intercourse and have children, so they can't pass on their genes. And it's just primitive, tribal, a vestige from primitive tribal times when people wanted their children to be heterosexual so that they can perpetuate their tribal genes. And I was very much against people who were against homosexuality, because I was like, no, you guys are just white supremacist Nazis. But then, then I started going on the other extreme, and I'm listening to the people who are like, no, homosexuality, causes a lot of disease. It's, the promiscuity does not bring about, it's not, as my grandpa would say, existentially valid, and there's a lot of problems involved with it. And so I went to the opposite extreme, and I became basically everything the opposite that I was before. I became like pro, anti-abortion, anti-feminism, Jezebel, very much anti, anti-homosexuality, communism. And in my mind, I was like, dude, these white supremacists are accurate. I was like, dude, communism, leftism is really just anti-white. It's just like a way to destroy white people and for the people of color to win. And then, now I would recognize, like, yeah, what's what the Hindus would talk about, like the Satan worshippers, the Shiva worshippers, the Dravidians, the demons tried to defeat the Aryan Brahmanism, tried to defeat religion. And I was a Satanist when I was anti-white, and I recognize that now. But then I became the opposite extreme. So I became, like, quote unquote, I went from being a Shiva worshiper to being a Vishnu worshiper, but I was an extremist Vishnu worshiper. And even when I was a Vishnu worshiper, I was still I was still arrogant. I was still, and I still think I saw myself more as black in ways, but I did not have a higher level of consciousness per se, but I was shifting away from the old thing. I just became the exact opposite. And I became very pro-white. So I went from being anti-white to being very pro-white. And so that's what happened in 2014. So I'll get more to the story in a minute.